Hello, welcome to Cardboard History. I'm David. Today I want to share with you a piece of history. And this is something that I acquired about 2 years ago. And it came in a way that I wasn't really expecting. It would have been my grandfather's brother passed away. And after his passing, he had a lot of family history that was sort of collected, and I was visiting my aunt, and she had several crates full of items from my family's history, and I was going through it, and I really enjoy genealogy. I think it kind of goes along with my love of the history of baseball, is just exploring the history of my family. And as I was looking through that, I came across a really interesting piece that has sort of bridged my enjoyment of genealogy and looking at my family's history with the history of baseball, and especially my love of the Chicago Cubs. So I want to turn around the camera first and just show you what this is and just look at some of the interesting things that are going on. So there was a newspaper that was in the box, and it is from October of 1907. And this is from the Pontiac Weekly Leader. Pontiac is a city in Illinois, south of Chicago. And this came after the Cubs won their World Series in 1907, and it tells a story about the Chicago Cubs coming to play in Pontiac. Manager James O'Neill, who was the manager of the Pontiac Pastimes, had reached a deal with the Chicago Cubs for them to come to Myers Field on a Friday afternoon and play. And it just tells a little bit about how the manager is trying to get some other players to help build out the Pontiac team to face off against the opponents. And it lists here some of the players, which would be Johnny Kling, Pat Moran, who I just did a video about, and telling a little bit of his story, Del Howard, Frank Chance, Joe Tinker. Really interesting that Tinker is spelled with a C there, as opposed to how you normally see it. Solly Hoffman, Mordecai Brown, Ed Rulbach, Jimmy Sheckard, Frank Schultz, Jimmy Slagle, and Harry Steinfeld. So these were the players that came to Pontiac. Assumingly this came out on Thursday, they would have been there the next day to play against the team. So this is really cool because it's a piece of Chicago Cubs history. But the reason why this was kept with my family's history is because on the other side here on the front page tells the story here about one Mrs. Rogie. And Mrs. Rogie was my third great-grandmother. And this is actually the story of how she passed away. She was in a terrible fire accident on Thursday. I think it would have been Thursday, the 24th. It says this morning. And she was gathering some flower seed, and the straw caught fire. And her clothing was on fire, and her daughter, who would have been my great-great-grandmother, came to try to help her. And they both had significant fire burns, and eventually she passed away later that evening from the burns. And the story is quite horrific, a little bit more horrific than I think what is typically shown in modern day newspaper. But this has, for me, just kind of connects my family's history with also the history of the Cubs, in that on one day, not only were the Cubs coming to Pontiac, but my family was also going through a grievous time. Now, she was, I believe, in her 70s or 80s. She was quite elderly at the time, so it wasn't as if she was really young, but still it's a terrible way to go. As I was looking through this newspaper, I try to be very careful because it's a little bit fragile. There were a few other interesting things of note that I just wanted to point out because I thought they were really interesting. The first here is a little clip about Billy Sunday. Billy Sunday was a baseball player for the Chicago White Stockings in the 1800s and famously gave up baseball to become a traveling evangelist. And this tells a little bit about his travel plans. And I thought that was just a really interesting part of history, baseball history, and also religion history. And then another story over here relating to baseball. The semi-pros are hard hit. And I'll go ahead and read this story because it's short in case you can't quite see. The National Baseball Commission held a long session at the Auditorium Annex in Chicago Sunday afternoon and handed down a number of important rulings, one of which hits the semi-professional clubs pretty hard. As soon as the new rule is promulgated, any player under the national agreement who plays against clubs containing ineligible men will be subject to a fine of $100. For instance, had the rule been in effect Sunday, each of the White Sox players would be liable to a fine of $100 for playing against Callahan's Logan squares. Now, Callahan's Logan squares is a really interesting part of Chicago baseball history. Callahan had started a semi-pro team, and he was very savvy in getting players who had in some way voided their contract, were suspended from the National League, and he put together some pretty great teams. In fact, in either 1906 or 1907, his team beat both. It was 1906. His team beat both the White Sox and the Cubs, and that was the year that the White Sox beat the Cubs in the World Series. And so his semi-pro team had managed to beat both teams that played in the World Series that year. And he did this by getting players who had been banned from baseball or who were in some way or another forbidden from playing, or they had been holding out and they were under contract and didn't want to play. And so this was a decision by the National Baseball Commission to try to stop this, to stop players who had violated contracts from going to other leagues. And they only had control over their players, so they had agreed that they would fine any players $100 that played against these teams that had rostered those that had been suspended or were holding out. And so this was a way for them to try to undermine the semi-pro teams. And so I thought that was a really interesting piece of history that was here, along with the little bit of my family's history and also the Chicago Cubs after their World Series win in 1907 coming to Pontiac to play. So thank you for taking time to look at this with me. It's definitely something that is probably one of the coolest things in my collection. And I am really glad that I was able to come across that. And just to have something that connects those two together is really cool for me. So thank you for taking time to check this out. I hope you enjoyed a little piece of history, and thank you for watching Cardboard History.